The first thing everyone noticed was the silence. It was not the good kind, not the calm kind. It was the kind that makes your ears feel full, like the room itself is holding its breath. I was standing by the long dining table, my fingers wrapped around a glass I had not touched. The candles flickered, throwing soft light across the room. Music played quietly in the background, a Happy New Year's song that did not match the heavy feelings sitting in my chest. Across from me stood my husband, Caleb. He was laughing, too loudly. Beside him was Irene, his ex. Her hand rested lightly on his arm, just for a second too long to be friendly. Her head leaned toward him as she spoke, her smile slow and knowing. She wore a deep red dress, the kind that asks to be noticed, and she was being noticed by my husband. Guests sat around the table pretending not to stare. Some smiled awkwardly. Others looked down at their plates, even though no food had been served yet. My mother-in-law adjusted the napkin on her lap. Again and again, her lips pressed into a thin line. And me? I smiled. I smiled so calmly that no one could guess what was happening inside me. Just hours earlier, Caleb had said the words that still echoed in my head. My ex is coming to the New Year's Eve dinner. He had said it while fixing his cufflinks like he was talking about the weather. I had looked up at him, surprised, hurt. But I did not argue. I did not ask why. I did not raise my voice. I just smiled and said, "Of course." Now here we were. Irene's eyes met mine across the table. There was something sharp in them, something proud, like she was testing me. Like she wanted to see if I would crack. I did not. The clock on the wall ticked loudly as it crept closer to midnight. Then, the doorbell rang. Every head turned. Caleb's laugh stopped in the middle of a breath. Irene's smile froze. My mother-in-law sat up straighter. I placed my glass down gently and walked toward the door. My steps were slow, steady. Each one felt like it echoed through the room. When I opened the door, cold night air rushed in. A man stood there. He was tall, well-dressed and calm. His coat was neatly buttoned, his hair brushed back. He held a small gift bag in one hand. His eyes were warm but curious, like he was walking into a place he had never seen before. He smiled at me. "Hello," he said politely. "I'm Julian. I'm here for the New Year's dinner." The room behind me went completely still. I stepped aside and smiled wider. "You're right on time," I said. Julian walked in. The moment his eyes landed on Irene, his face lit up. "There you are," he said, walking toward her. "I thought I was early." Irene did not move. Her face drained of colour so fast it was almost scary. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Caleb took one step back. Just one. It was small, but I saw it. Julian leaned in and kissed Irene gently on the cheek. "Happy New Year, love," he said. Someone gasped. Irene finally laughed, but it was high and thin, like glass about to break. "Julian, you're here early," he chuckled. "You said to come before midnight, remember? I didn't want to miss the countdown with you." Caleb's hands curled into fists at his sides. I closed the door quietly and walked back toward the table. "My husband," I said calmly, placing a hand on Caleb's arm. "This is Julian." Caleb stared at him like he was seeing a ghost. Julian turned and offered his hand. "Nice to finally meet you," he said warmly. "Irene has mentioned you before." The word "before" hung in the air. Caleb did not take the hand. My mother-in-law cleared her throat. "Why don't we all sit down?" she said, forcing a smile. Everyone obeyed. Plates clinked. Chairs scraped against the floor. Julian sat beside Irene, his arm resting comfortably behind her chair. Caleb sat stiffly next to me, his knee bouncing under the table. I could feel his tension without looking at him. Julian began to speak easily, thanking everyone for welcoming him. He talked about the long drive, the traffic, the cold air outside. Normal things. safe things, but every word he said seemed to tighten the room. Irene barely touched her food. Caleb did not eat at all. I watched them both quietly. I watched Irene avoid my eyes. I watched Caleb's jaw tighten every time Julian laughed. I watched the way my husband kept glancing at me like he was trying to read my face. But there was nothing to read. I was calm. That was what destroyed him the most. Julian raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said with a smile, "and to being surrounded by people who matter." Everyone lifted their glasses. Even Caleb. Our glasses touched lightly, and for a brief moment I looked at my husband. His eyes were filled with fear. Not anger. Fear. The clock struck once, marking the final minutes of the year. Julian leaned toward Irene and whispered something that made her flinch. She forced another smile, nodding quickly. I reached for my napkin and folded it slowly. No one shouted, no one accused, not yet. But the truth was already sitting at the table, dressed nicely, smiling politely, and eating dinner like it belonged there. And this was only the beginning. People think betrayal always comes loudly. They imagine shouting, slammed doors, broken phones, and angry words. But that is not how it started for me. For me, it began quietly. So quietly that for a long time, I wondered if I was just imagining things. When I first married Caleb, I believed I was lucky. He was charming, confident, and warm in public. He held my hand when we walked into rooms. He spoke proudly of me to friends. He said all the right things. He told me marriage was about honesty, respect, and trust. I believed him. In the beginning, Irene barely existed in our lives. She was just a name from the past. "My ex," he would say, with a small shrug like she was something old he no longer needed. "She's part of my history," he once told me, "not my present." I accepted that. But slowly, small things began to change. It started with phone calls. Caleb would step outside to take them. At first, he said it was work. Then it was just a friend. I did not question him. Everyone deserves privacy, I told myself. But something about the timing felt wrong. The calls often came late in the evening. Sometimes his mood would change after them. He would become quiet, distant. Other times he would be strangely cheerful, like someone who had just been reminded of something pleasant. One night I asked him directly, "Is everything okay?" He smiled and kissed my forehead. "You worry too much," he said. That was the first time I felt foolish for asking. The second time came months later, when Irene appeared again. She showed up at a family event unannounced. She walked in like she belonged there. My mother-in-law greeted her warmly, almost eagerly. I noticed how comfortable she seemed, how familiar everything was to her. When Caleb saw her, his face lit up in a way I had not seen in a while. They hugged. It was not a long hug, but it was not short either. I stood there, smiling politely, telling myself not to be dramatic. Irene turned to me and looked me up and down slowly like she was measuring me. Then she smiled sweetly. "So you're the wife," she said. "Not my name, just the title." "Yes," I replied. "I am." She laughed lightly. Caleb always did move fast. Caleb laughed too. I did not. From that day on, Irene was never far away. She appeared at gatherings. She called Caleb about old memories or unfinished paperwork. She sent messages late at night that he never opened in front of me. And every time I felt uncomfortable, Caleb made me feel small for it. "She's just a person from my past," he said. "You're reading too much into it," he said. "You're letting jealousy ruin your peace," he said. So I stayed quiet. I told myself that trust meant silence, but silence began to hurt. The night he told me Irene was coming to the New Year's Eve dinner, something inside me shifted. We were standing in our bedroom. He was adjusting his jacket in the mirror, his voice calm and casual. Irene will be there, he said. She's family to my mother. Family? I felt the word hit me like cold water. I asked softly, "Do you think that's appropriate?" He sighed like I had disappointed him. "Why wouldn't it be? We're adults. There's nothing there anymore." I looked at his reflection. He would not meet my eyes. That was when I smiled. "Of course," I said. But that night, when he fell asleep, I stayed awake. I replayed every moment I had ignored. Every time my feelings were brushed aside, every time I was made to feel like the problem. And then I asked myself a simple question. What don't I know? I did not spy. I did not snoop. I did not break into phones or accounts. I simply listened. I listened when Caleb spoke too carefully about Irene. I listened when my mother-in-law praised her a little too often. I listened when Irene herself spoke, always choosing her words like she was hiding something fragile. That was when I learned she was engaged. Not from Caleb, from someone else. It was mentioned casually in a conversation, like it was common knowledge. Irene had a fiancé, a serious one, a man she planned to marry soon. When I asked Caleb about it later, he froze for just a second before smiling. "Oh, that," he said. "Yeah, I heard something about that." He did not sound surprised. That silence told me everything. If Irene had moved on, why was she still holding space in my marriage? That question stayed with me. By the time New Year's Eve arrived, I was no longer confused. I was calm. And calm is dangerous when it comes from understanding. As I sat at the dinner table that night, watching Julian speak kindly to everyone, watching Irene struggle to keep her smile steady, watching Caleb shrink into himself, I knew one thing for sure. I had not brought chaos into that room. I had brought truth. And truth does not need to shout to be heard. After the night Caleb told me his ex was coming to the New Year's Eve dinner, I stopped asking questions out loud, not because I was afraid, but because I was listening. There is a difference. When you stop trying to prove your feelings and start paying attention, people reveal themselves without knowing it. They speak more freely. They make small mistakes. They assume you are no longer watching. That was what I did. I watched. Caleb became careful with his words but careless with his habits. He talked about Irene as if she was distant, yet her name slipped into conversations too often. He would say things like, "Irene always hated this kind of weather," or "Irene used to love that restaurant." Used to, but his voice did not sound like someone talking about the past. It sounded like someone still standing in it. I noticed how his phone lit up with messages he never opened near me. I noticed how my mother-in-law mentioned Irene's name with warmth while speaking about me with polite approval, never affection. And I noticed something else. Whenever I brought up the future, holidays, plans, even simple things, Caleb became uncomfortable, like someone who was afraid of choosing one path because it meant closing another. That was when I knew. I did not confront him. I did not cry. I did not argue. I chose clarity. One afternoon, while helping my mother-in-law sort old photos, I heard it said out loud for the first time. "Irene's engagement photos came out beautifully," she said casually. "Such a lovely couple." My hands froze. "Engagement?" I asked calmly. She looked at me surprised. "Oh, didn't you know?" I smiled. I must have missed that. She frowned slightly, then waved it off. "Well, yes. She's been engaged for a while now, to a man named Julian. Very respectable, very serious. Very serious." That night I asked Caleb again. "She's engaged?" I said lightly, like it meant nothing. He hesitated. Just for a breath. "Yes," he said. "I think so. Think so." That was the moment I stopped guessing. If Irene had truly moved on, Caleb would not be hiding it. If Caleb had truly moved on, Irene would not still be circling our lives. Something was unfinished. and unfinished things always come back unless you face them. So I decided to face it. I did not reach out to Irene. I did not accuse her of anything. I did not demand explanations. I reached out to Julian. Finding him was not hard. He was not hiding. His life was open and honest, the way people are when they have nothing to conceal. He spoke proudly about Irene online. He shared photos of them smiling, traveling, planning a future. I stared at those pictures for a long time. She looked happy. Or at least, she looked like she wanted people to think she was. I wrote him a simple message. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. Just the truth. I told him who I was. I told him I was married to Caleb. I told him there was a New Year's Eve dinner planned and that Irene would be there. And then I invited him. Not as a trap. As a seat at the table. He replied faster than I expected. He thanked me for the invitation. He said he was surprised but grateful. He said he was looking forward to meeting everyone properly. He did not ask suspicious questions. Because honest people do not expect lies. When I closed my phone, my hands were steady. I did not feel proud. I did not feel angry. I felt finished with confusion. The days leading up to New Year's Eve were strange. Caleb became more nervous. He double-checked plans. He asked who was coming, what time people would arrive, how long they would stay. He watched me closely, like he expected me to break. But I did not. I smiled. I planned. I cooked. I sent polite messages. I acted like a woman preparing a normal dinner. Because to me it was normal. Normal to invite everyone who belonged to the truth. On the night of the dinner, as guests arrived and laughter filled the house, I felt calm in a way I had not felt in months. Not because I was winning, but because I was no longer lying to myself. When Julian arrived and the room shifted, I did not feel joy at their shock. I felt relief. As dinner continued, I watched everything carefully. Julian was kind. He thanked my mother-in-law for the food. He asked questions. He listened. He spoke with confidence, but not arrogance. He talked about his work, about traveling with Irene, about plans they had made together. Each word was gentle, and each word pressed deeper into the space Caleb and Irene had tried to keep hidden. Irene interrupted Julian more than once. She laughed too quickly. She corrected him on small details that did not matter. Caleb barely spoke. He stared at his plate, then at his glass, then at me. I did not look away. At one point, Julian smiled and said, "It's funny, actually. Irene and I reconnected right around the time she said she finally felt closure with her past." Irene's fork slipped from her hand and clattered against the plate. "Oh, you don't have to share all that," she said quickly, forcing a laugh. Julian blinked. "I thought, it's fine," she said. "Just not necessary." The table fell quiet. I saw my mother-in-law stiffen. I saw Leo raise his eyebrows slightly. I saw Caleb swallow hard. And I saw the truth take shape without anyone naming it. I said nothing. Because I didn't need to. The rest of the evening moved slowly. Conversations felt careful now, like everyone was walking on glass. The countdown clock ticked closer to midnight, but the celebration was gone. Julian, still unaware of the full weight of the room, leaned toward Irene and spoke softly. "I'm glad we're all together," he said. "It feels right." Irene nodded, but her eyes were glossy. Caleb did not look at either of them. As the clock struck midnight and people raised their glasses, Julian smiled and reached for Irene's hand. Caleb flinched. I watched my husband in that moment and saw him clearly for the first time, not as a man torn between two women, but as a man who believed he could hold two truths at once and never be held accountable for either. That belief was already breaking, and I did not have to lift a finger to make it happen. I simply invited the truth to sit down. And once the truth is seated, it does not leave quietly. After midnight passed, no one mentioned the new year. The glasses were raised, the countdown was done, but the feeling that usually comes with it, the hope, the laughter, the fresh start, never arrived. It felt like the clock had moved forward while everyone at the table stayed frozen in the same moment. I noticed it in the way people sat. My mother-in-law kept adjusting her napkin, folding and unfolding it as if it were the only thing she could control. Leo leaned back in his chair, quiet now, his eyes moving from face to face. The other guests spoke less and less, their voices soft, careful. Julian, however, remained the same. He was still polite, still warm, still unaware of the full shape of the storm he had walked into. And that was what made everything heavier. He reached for the bottle of wine and poured a little more into his glass, smiling. "This is a beautiful way to start the year," he said. "It's nice to finally meet everyone Irene talks about." Irene stiffened. Her fingers tightened around her fork. "I don't talk about everyone," she said quickly. Julian laughed lightly. "You talk about your past. About growing up together, about shared memories." Caleb's head snapped up. "That's not—" he started, then stopped himself. Silence filled the space between us. Julian looked confused. "I'm sorry," he said, glancing around. "Did I say something wrong?" "No," Irene said too fast. "It's just not important." But it was important. Everyone felt it. Julian frowned slightly, then shrugged, trying to move on. "Well, anyway, I'm grateful to be here, especially after everything Irene told me about how hard it was for her to let go of old attachments." The word attachments landed like a dropped plate. Irene's face went pale. Caleb pushed his chair back just a little, the legs scraping softly against the floor. His breathing changed, shorter, sharper. I turned my head slowly and looked at him. He would not meet my eyes. Julian noticed the tension now. Anyone would have. He sat up straighter, his smile fading as he scanned the table. "I feel like I'm missing something," he said carefully. No one answered. The ticking of the clock grew louder again. Finally, my mother-in-law cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should bring out dessert," she said, her voice tight. "It's been a long evening." I stood up. "I'll get it," I said. In the kitchen, away from the table, I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes for a moment. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I felt strangely steady. I had spent so long questioning my instincts, my feelings, my worth. Now, watching the truth surface on its own, I felt grounded in a way I hadn't before. When I returned with the dessert tray, the energy at the table had changed again. Julian was no longer relaxed. He sat with his hands folded, his eyes fixed on Irene. She avoided his gaze, staring at her plate like it held answers. "Irene," he said gently. "You said tonight was important." She swallowed. "It is." "You also said Caleb was just someone from your past." Caleb's shoulders tensed. Julian turned to him. "Is that right?" Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it. I watched him struggle to find words that would not betray him further. "Yes," he finally said. "That's right." Julian nodded slowly. "Then, help me understand something." The room seemed to shrink. "You told me you and Irene stopped speaking regularly years ago," Julian continued. "But tonight, I've heard stories and details that suggest otherwise." Irene shook her head slightly. "You're misunderstanding." "Am I?" Julian asked softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. "Irene," he said, "you told me you reconnected with me after finding closure." She looked up at him now, her eyes glossy. "I did find closure." Julian looked at Caleb. "When?" Caleb stood abruptly. "This is not the place for this conversation." "It became the place the moment I walked in," Julian replied. My mother-in-law gasped. "Enough," she said sharply. "This is a family dinner." Julian nodded respectfully. "Exactly. And I was invited as family." His words hung in the air. I set the dessert down quietly. All eyes turned to me. Caleb looked at me now, really looked at me, like he was finally seeing the shape of what he had lost. You invited him, he said. It was not a question. Yes, I replied calmly. Why? He demanded, his voice shaking. I held his gaze. Because he deserved to be here. Julian turned to me, surprised. You knew. I knew enough, I said. Irene let out a quiet sob. This isn't fair. Julian stood slowly. Then explain it to me, he said. Please. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Caleb stepped forward. You're blowing this out of proportion, he said. There's nothing going on. Julian looked at him steadily. Then why does it feel like everyone has been lying? No one answered. Because no one could. Leo finally spoke. Sometimes silence answers better than words. Julian nodded, absorbing that. He turned back to Irene. Tell me the truth, he said. All of it. Irene's shoulders slumped. The woman who had walked in confident and polished now looked small, tired. We never stopped talking, she admitted quietly. Not really. Caleb's face drained of colour. Julian took a step back. And you told me you had. I didn't think it mattered anymore, she whispered. Julian laughed once, but there was no humour in it. It matters when you build a future on it. Caleb reached out. Irene? Don't, Julian said sharply. That was the first time his voice hardened. The room felt cold now. I looked at Caleb and saw panic where confidence used to live. His carefully balanced world was tipping, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Not because I pushed, but because the truth finally had space to stand, and it was standing very tall. No one spoke for a long moment after Irene's words. We never stopped talking. They hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Julian stood very still. His hands were at his sides, but his fingers curled slowly, then relaxed again, like he was holding himself together by choice. Not force. He did not shout. He did not pace. He did not ask the same question twice. That scared me more than anger ever could. Caleb looked like a man who had been pushed to the edge of a cliff and had only just realised there was nothing behind him. Irene, he said again, softer now. You don't have to do this. Julian turned to him slowly. Do what? He asked. Tell the truth? Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since I had known him, he had no story ready. No smooth explanation. No way to turn the room in his favour. My mother-in-law pressed a hand to her chest. Irene, she said, her voice trembling. Is this true? Irene nodded weakly. Yes. The room reacted all at once. A sharp breath. A chair scraping back. Someone whispering, Oh my. Julian took a step away from Irene, creating space between them that felt wider than the table itself. How long? He asked. Irene shook her head. It wasn't like that. Not always. That's not an answer, Julian said gently. She swallowed. We talked. We met sometimes. It was familiar. Julian nodded slowly, as if each word was clicking into place. While you were planning a future with me. She looked down. Caleb stepped forward again. This isn't fair, he said. You're making it sound worse than it was. I finally spoke. It sounds exactly like what it was, I said. Every eye turned to me. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply stood up straight and spoke clearly. You told me she was part of your past, I said to Caleb. You told me there was nothing left. And all this time, you were still holding the door open. Caleb shook his head. I never meant to hurt you. Julian laughed softly without humour. Funny how that sentence always comes after the hurt. Caleb turned to him, desperate now. You don't understand our history. Julian met his eyes. History explains behaviour. It doesn't excuse it. That was the moment I saw something break in Caleb. Not loudly, quietly. His shoulders dropped. His confidence drained out of him like water from a cracked glass. He looked around the table, searching for support, but found none. My mother-in-law would not meet his eyes. Leo shook his head slowly. The guests sat in silence, watching the truth do what it always does when it finally arrives, strip away every excuse. Julian took a deep breath. "I asked you to be honest with me from the beginning," he said to Irene. "I trusted you." Tears ran down her cheeks now. "I was afraid," she whispered. "I didn't want to lose you." Julian nodded. "So you chose to lie instead?" He turned to Caleb. "And you," he said, his voice firm. "You let me walk into this room like a fool." Caleb tried to speak, but Julian raised a hand. "No," he said. "I'm done listening." He turned back to Irene. "You need to decide what kind of person you are, because I won't build my life on half-truths." The words were calm, but they landed hard. Irene reached for him. "Julian, please." He stepped back. "I'm leaving," he said. The room stirred again. "You're just going to walk out?" my mother-in-law asked. Julian nodded. "Yes, with my dignity." He looked at me then. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" I asked. "For not letting me marry a lie." He picked up his coat and walked to the door. When it closed behind him, the house felt emptier, but clearer. Irene sank into her chair, sobbing. Caleb turned to me. "This was your plan," he said. "No," I replied. "This was your choice. I just stopped protecting it." He stared at me, his eyes red. "You embarrassed me." I tilted my head slightly. "You embarrassed yourself." The guests began to leave quietly, one by one. No one stayed to comfort Caleb. No one defended him. When the house finally emptied, it was just the three of us. Caleb, Irene, and me. Irene stood up slowly. "I should go," she said, her voice broken. My mother-in-law nodded stiffly. "Yes, you should." Irene hesitated, then looked at Caleb. "I never wanted this." Caleb said nothing. She left without another word. The silence that followed was different now. Not tense. Final. Caleb sank into a chair, rubbing his face with his hands. "I don't know how this happened." I walked over and stood in front of him. "It happened because you believed you could keep parts of your life separate forever." He looked up at me. "Can we fix this?" I thought about all the times I had doubted myself, all the nights I lay awake wondering if I was too sensitive, too jealous, too much. "No," I said gently. "You broke this long before tonight." Tears filled his eyes. "I love you." I nodded. "You may believe that, but love doesn't look like secrets." I turned and walked away. In the days that followed, the damage became clear. Julian ended the engagement. Irene disappeared from our lives completely. My mother-in-law stopped calling as often, ashamed and confused. And Caleb? Caleb lost more than his marriage. He lost the version of himself he liked to believe in. He tried to explain, to apologize, to rewrite the story. But the truth had already been told. I moved out quietly. No drama, no shouting, just peace. On the first night alone in my new place, I stood by the window and watched fireworks from a distance, late ones people had saved. I felt tired, but I also felt free. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is smile, say, "Of course," and let the truth walk in on its own. And when it does, it destroys the lies that were never meant to survive. The house felt different after everyone left. Not empty, just honest. For the first time since I could remember, the walls were not holding secrets. The air was not heavy with things unsaid. It was quiet, yes, but it was the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed. Not the kind that warns one is coming. Caleb sat alone at the dining table long after I went upstairs to pack a small bag. I did not rush. I did not shake. My hands moved slowly, carefully, like they finally trusted me again. I packed only what I needed: a few clothes, my journal, the photo of my late father that I always kept close, things that reminded me who I was before I learned how to shrink myself for someone else's comfort. When I came back downstairs, Caleb looked up at me like a man waking from a bad dream. "You're really leaving," he said. "Yes," I answered. He stood up quickly. "Please, just stay tonight." I looked at him for a long moment, at the man I married, at the man who smiled when I doubted myself, at the man who called my pain jealousy and my questions insecurity. "I stayed through everything," I said softly. "Tonight is the first time I'm choosing myself." His shoulders sagged. "I don't know who I am without you." "That's something you should have thought about before you risked losing me," I replied. I picked up my bag. He did not stop me again. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. There were no angry calls, no dramatic scenes, no public apologies, just a slow unraveling of everything Caleb once thought was solid. Word spread quickly. People always notice when a marriage breaks in a way that cannot be explained away with polite excuses. Friends asked questions, family members whispered, stories changed depending on who told them. But the truth stayed the same. Julian ended the engagement completely. Not with yelling, not with blame, just a clean ending. He returned the ring and asked for space. Irene tried to call him. He did not answer. She tried to call me too. I did not answer either. Some chapters do not need conversations. They just need endings. My mother-in-law called a week later. "I didn't raise him this way," she said, her voice tired. I did not argue. "I hope you find peace," I replied. That was all. Caleb called every few days at first, then every night, then less often. "I'm in therapy," he said once. "I finally understand," he said another time. "I miss you," he said most of all. I listened, but I did not return. Understanding after destruction does not rebuild what was broken. It only explains why it collapsed. I moved into a small apartment with tall windows and soft morning light. The first night there, I slept better than I had in years. No wondering, no listening for footsteps, no waiting for explanations that never came. Just sleep. I started doing small things for myself again. I cooked meals I liked instead of meals that avoided complaints. I walked in the evenings without checking the time. I laughed without wondering if it sounded too loud. Slowly, I felt myself coming back. Not the woman I was before the marriage, but someone stronger, someone clearer. I wrote often, about the signs I ignored, about the ways I learned to doubt my own instincts, about the moment I stopped trying to be chosen and chose myself instead. Each page felt like breathing out after holding my breath for too long. I moved into a small apartment with tall windows and soft morning light. The first night there, I slept better than I had in years. No wondering, no listening for footsteps, no waiting for explanations that never came. Just sleep. I started doing small things for myself again. I cooked meals I liked instead of meals that avoided complaints. I walked in the evenings without checking the time. I laughed without wondering if it sounded too loud. Slowly, I felt myself coming back. Not the woman I was before the marriage, but someone stronger, someone clearer. I wrote often about the signs I ignored, about the ways I learned to doubt my own instincts, about the moment I stopped trying to be chosen and chose myself instead. Each page felt like breathing out after holding my breath for too long. Caleb asked to see me one final time. "Just to talk," he said. "No pressure." I agreed, because I no longer feared being pulled back. We met in a quiet cafe, neutral ground, no memories in the walls. He looked different, thinner, tired, humbled. "I lost everything," he said after a long silence. "No," I replied gently. You lost what you refused to protect. He nodded. I thought I could manage it. Keep everyone happy. That's the lie, I said. You kept yourself comfortable. Everyone else paid the price. He swallowed. I'm sorry. I know, I said. And I forgive you. His eyes widened. You do? Yes, I answered. For my peace, not for your relief. He smiled sadly. You're not coming back. No, I said again. He nodded slowly, finally accepting it. We stood, said goodbye, and this time, it felt complete. Irene moved away. Some said she went to start over. Others said she could not stand being reminded of what she lost. Either way, she faded from my life like a chapter that ended when it taught its lesson. Julian thrived. I heard through mutual circles that he focused on his work, travelled, and grew lighter with time. He learned the truth before it became a lifetime of doubt. That mattered. As for Caleb, he changed. Not overnight. Not perfectly, but slowly. Some people only learn when consequences finally speak louder than excuses. 1 year later, on another New Year's Eve, I stood on my balcony with a warm drink in my hands. Fireworks bloomed across the sky, bright, loud, unapologetic. I thought about that dinner, that smile, that moment I said, of course. People often ask me if I plan to destroy my husband. The truth is simpler. I plan to stop destroying myself. Inviting the truth into that room did not ruin his life. It revealed it. And once revealed, it could no longer pretend. I smiled as the clock struck midnight. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was real. And that, finally, was enough.